Let's see if this works, because it should work, but... Yep, we got excellent connection, and we are live.
All
Um,
right.
I'm gonna see. Yep. All right. So I'm gonna post this on Facebook. Reminders to everybody that YouTube changed their settings recently, and now every time I hit start streaming, I have to wonder whether or not my connection is good, whether or not I sound good, whether or not like any of these things that I could have like figured out beforehand because YouTube used to have this go live button that you could click. Um, so if you want to annoy somebody, annoy YouTube. But anyway, I'm gonna post this on Facebook, tagging the people who asked to be tagged. And I already posted it on Twitter. You can follow me at all social media. Pretty much I'm everywhere, including the ones that I hate and constantly shit on, like Parlor. Um, but you can find me anywhere at Insanity is Free. This is going to be a new series that I'm starting called Victims of Biden. And, like, given the fact that he's very likely going to be the next president-elect, reasonably speaking, I have to keep my promise where I'm gonna go just as hard against the other side, quote, because they're both on the same side. So it's kind of moot to say, the side that Biden's on. Um, Getting a message on Twitter. Let me check that. That's, I mean, starting now. They asked when it's starting, and it's already started. But I'm pretty much going to go against Biden as hard as I went against Trump. And there's a lot of material because he has a long history of supporting the military, prison, and intelligence industrial complexes. And with all that in mind, this is going to be episode 1, and it's going to be covering somebody whose wife was texting him from Yemen, where she lived, due to immigration bullshit. And reasonably speaking, very terrified because of the U.S. Bombs that were dropped right near her. So Biden didn't oppose these policies, and as a result, we have years and years of catastrophe unopposed by any administration. So with that in mind, I want to read the original thread that sort of spurred this because I basically asked like what one thing you don't like about Biden is, and I got a lot of material, a lot of people who might possibly be coming on to discuss what happened to them, their family, etc. But basically, he said like his story in the comments here, and it was like a link to a story he had already written too. So I'm gonna read this. A story. Easter Sunday 2015. My wife texted me from Sana'a to tell me that no matter what happens, I was her hero, and that I should know I'm a good man. Thinking this somewhat odd and a bit ominous, I called her. She told me that there had been several bombs dropped in the last half hour within 100 or so meters of her family's home, and that she believed she might die, and she wanted me to know she loved me. The bombs being dropped might have had Saudi stickers on them, but they were essentially the product of the American empire. Obama was president then, his VP was Joe Biden. I've not heard one word of critique from Biden about his or Obama's role in what is happening now in Yemen. Sure, his website says he's against it, which is easy to say once he could lay it in Trump's lap as its current custodian. While Trump, like every president, is a monster, if you think my lack of support for Biden or my refusal to forgive him or Obama is based in racism, I'm going to tell you to fuck off. You've not had that phone call. You've never been powerless to help your loved ones in the face of an all-powerful, impersonal, imperial machine. You just don't know, and you better hope you never will. This is not only relevant for my own personal vendetta, it's my sincere belief that as soon as Trump is out of the way, be that this coming January or in 2025, the quote resistance will go back to pulling the quote resistance will go back to pulling the same shit. I don't believe for a moment that anything has changed. Now, I wanted to ask, because that's a powerful story. First off, how did you meet your wife?
So we met in college. I went to George Mason here in Virginia, and we had a class together. She happened to be here. Her father was working in D.C., so she was here for a couple of years during high school and in college, where we met. And um, we were both young, early 20s, not necessarily ready to get married, and so there was really no way of her being able to stay in the U.S. short of that. And so she went back to Yemen for a couple of years until 2015, when we were able to arrange for her to come back to the United States, and we were able to get married and live our lives like normal people. But yeah, that's how we met.
Mm. Okay, and in that regard, with regard to that immigration thing, why don't we talk briefly about immigration policy and how it negatively impacted your wife? Because if I understand it correctly, she was sent back under Biden, or
So Obama was president, yeah, and Biden was vice president. But if you want to legally be in the United States, you have to have permission from the federal government. And unless you have specific reasons for that, be it, be on a student visa, be on an employment visa or employment, based green card, or you are the relative of a U.S. citizen, pretty much with rare exceptions, you cannot be in the United States. So if we weren't going to get married, which at that time in our lives, we were not necessarily ready for that. As you can imagine, people when they're that young making a huge decision like that, you can't stay. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to stay here, work for, Joe flipping burgers or whatever,
right,
and figure things out. You have to make a decision.
right? So okay, so um, this sort of policy, uh, it paid for her to be in the U.S., or was she in the U.S. on a work visa, or
Well, she was here as a student on a student visa.
okay, all right.
So she was attending school, but once you're done with school, you're no longer a student. So you can't still be a student on a student visa.
So she basically would have had to marry in or get out or find another visa.
Pretty much. Yeah, I mean, you could try to get an employment-based green card or employment-based visa, but those are very, very difficult to get. The quotas for those, I mean, people are waiting years, decades, really, to get those. So if you, the number one ticket to get in the United States is if you have an immediate relative, a parent, minor child, or a spouse.
Gotcha. Yeah, because a lot of people try to claim that Obama was some sort of immigration saint when not only
No.
did he deport a huge amount of people, so much so that he got called the Great Deporter, but
Yep.
also he had the ICE detention facilities that Trump would eventually get blamed for. He's the one who constructed those and instituted their use initially. So the fact that your wife was even deported initially back to Yemen was also the result of him not really being that liberal on immigration to begin with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my wife wasn't technically deported. She left, as status was up, she decided to leave.
Right.
But yeah, she didn't have a legal option to stay short of marrying me. And at that point, even knowing myself now, a decade or so later, I know that I was not ready to make that step. I was a totally different person. As you can imagine, anybody from 22 to 32 become totally grow up and kind of change your direction. And I wasn't going to be a good spouse at that time. I know for sure.
Yeah, very reasonable. Like you made the mature decision. So on that score, she moves back to Yemen. She moves back into her family home immediately, or
Yeah, she spent some time visiting relatives in the village as well, where her father grew up. But pretty much for most of that time, she was in the family home in Yemen, in Sana'a.
gotcha. Um, so with regards to that, how peaceful is it normally there?
I would say relatively safe. There are occasionally suicide bombings or people being shot at, but that's largely government-based violence. The government of both the former president Saleh and the current president, sort of president Mansour Hadi, both engaged in state-based violence. Anybody who critiqued them or was a threat, they usually would have them blown up or shot or threaten them, something like that. That's predominantly where the violence was based, was political.
Gotcha. Well, and just to touch on that briefly, um, everybody likes to act like somebody's presidential legacy doesn't matter after they're out. But like oh, they're gone. That means you should stop criticizing them now. Well, no. And one of the presidents I criticize pretty regularly is Jimmy Carter for his role in Operation Cyclone, which was the operation that allowed Zbigniew Brzezinski and the CIA to arm, fund, and train the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and point them at Russia like a fucking gun. And say, the land of the north is yours, Allah's on your side, all that sort of noise. And they are the ones who taught them how to make IEDs, and there were no suicide bombings before the U.S. got there. Like, no record of it exists. So, I mean,
Right.
the U.S. started that bloody legacy to begin with. And then, like, it was maintained with, like, all of the justified wars, at least, in the eyes of the state, that came to the Middle East after that, like Bill Clinton's war crimes in Sudan and Kosovo, and, George Bush's fucking highway of death, and fucking George W. Bush's fucking war on terror and all the terror that brought. So, like, ultimately, Biden and Obama continued a legacy of essentially backing the U.S.'s decision to stick its nose where it oughtn't belong.
No, yeah, absolutely, and it's not just that recent. In Yemen in particular, it goes back several decades. It goes back not just the United States; it also involves the UK, the USSR, all of whom had a role in arming various groups within the country for their own imperial reasons, to try to control various factions, control the country, control the ports. And so when people look at, where did all these weapons come from, and they like to point at Iran as the bad guy in Yemen in particular, they forget the fact that for several decades these countries were arming various groups to a large extent. I mean, Saleh's army, the former president in Yemen, was armed a lot by George W. Bush and Obama as they were trying to buff up his regime in the war on terror. And when this whole kind of civil war erupted, a lot of that army sided with the rebels, and so they took those weapons with them. So it's the idea that you can lay it on Iran is the big bad guy is a total farce.
Well, and honestly, the U.S. has been trying to find a way to villainize Iran for a long time now.
Yeah, absolutely.
They won't play ball with our banking. They won't play ball with our nuclear bullshit. They won't play ball with the policies that the U.S. wants to institute in the Middle East, and that's why the U.S. justified bombing Soleimani. Um,
Hmm. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so like the whole idea of a country that has never attacked us being like worthy of military action is pretty amusing to me, to say the least. Um, but I mean, the U.S. has a long history of that too, given the fact that, like, under the Obama administration, the first two American citizens were extrajudicially assassinated in front of everyone. Like, there's been plenty of that done by shady bullshit, black money, like body counts from the CIA, but like and not just them, but the FBI. There's been a lot of assassination going around, like
Sure. No, absolutely.
removing inconvenient people, but this was the first time that they had not only done it in broad daylight, but then justified and joked about it, where Obama's in front of like the fucking whatever presidential dinner thing and making jokes about droning the Jonas brothers. Like, it's so funny to commit basically a war crime,
Yeah.
But like, so that's the legacy in that regard. Now, what was the environment surrounding Yemen at the time, like before the bombings started to happen near her?
So in 2014, the Houthis, Ansar Allah is their official name, they took power in Sana'a, um, kind of overthrew the government of the president Mansour Hadi, and started to kind of run things. And this took place really from mid 2014 until the early part of 2015, which was when the bombing started in March. And it was kind of at that point an internal struggle. To keep things kind of brief, the Houthis have kind of a long series of grievances that they feel like they have with the government. Um, so they decided that they weren't going to play ball. The former president Saleh, who had stepped down in 2011 in favor of Mansour Hadi, he decided that this was his time to kind of do a power play, ally with the Houthis, to try to get his old position back. The goal, probably, of both groups was to use each other and betray one another at some point. So it was kind of a complex internal struggle. There's other parties involved as well. But the United States decided, along with their allies in the Gulf states, predominantly Saudi Arabia, to put the thumb on the scale of President Hadi and try to reinstall him and take the Houthis out. And to that end, they've been bombing the northern part of Yemen for the last 5 years, both Sana'a and some of the other northern provinces.
Okay, and with regards to that, what's the local sentiment? Is there like division in that regard? Who are they mostly siding with?
I would say at first there was probably a lot of sympathy with the Houthis. Since maybe the last 2 or 3 years, kind of the tide has turned against them because they've taken a heavy-handed approach, as is typical with any kind of regime. People do things that are unpopular. But I think most people in the country are resentful of the fact that they're currently being bombed and they can't just deal with the Houthis on their own without having to also deal with bombs coming from the sky.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what was your wife's environment in that regard? Did she like was she constantly afraid of that sort of thing, or was this real new to her?
It was new. I mean, she had a fairly safe. There was, a few incidents. Somebody at one point, the school she taught at, somebody had come with a gun to the outside, just in a threatening manner, and one of the guards kind of talked them down, and they went on their way. But nothing to this extent. There was not any kind of real fear that that would happen. It was relatively safe. As safe as you can imagine the average American living.
Interesting. So there are guards at the schools there?
At the private schools.
Okay.
There's a lot of private English teaching schools, one of which she taught at, and they had an armed guard. So it just depends. Some of the more higher end schools do.
Gotcha. All right, so you called her on the phone. How did that phone call go?
Well, I mean, it went pretty much. For me, I was concerned about her well-being because you get a text like that and you're like, well, what the heck is going on? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was more worried from the beginning of the war myself anyway, and even just in general because you read the news and you think, oh, something might happen, blah
Right.
blah blah, and so for me, I was already concerned, and just in general, but getting that kind of added and heightened my concern. Um, she was, I could tell that she was upset and worried and scared, and not being able to do anything. It's not like, if you've got a loved one here and they're in the next state over, you can just hop in your car and go. You're kind of trying to comfort someone from 7,000 miles away that you can't at all get to. And that was very hard for me because, you know, you don't know if, are you not going to ever see this person ever again? Are you not going to be able to talk to them ever again? Is that it for you? And just trying to put that in your own head and try to think like, we're not old people. We're not we're not sickly. We're two young, healthy people. We shouldn't be having those thoughts.
Right. Okay, so I mean, what did she say at the time? Like, did she say anything about the environment surrounding her, like how her family was feeling?
Her family actually had kind of come to peace with it. Um, I think when people are older, they kind of feel like when if death is going to come for you, it's nothing you can do. Um, and my wife eventually kind of sort of had that approach because it's the only way you can cope with it after some point, when it's been several months of that. But at the time, she was very worried, and I'd had one other phone call before with her, maybe a week before that, where it was something very similar. She had actually called me and was saying that she was scared. There were several bombs that had gone off nearby, just like that Easter Sunday, and that she kind of thought that it might be it, and she just wanted me to know that she loved me and she cared about me, and that I shouldn't feel guilty that I wasn't able to do anything,
Right.
and kind of wanting to give me closure if that was it, you know.
So okay, there's a lot of talk, and I do mean talk because most of them haven't experienced it. But in the U.S., there's a lot of talk about like how it is to grow up as a school child in the U.S., where like your school could get shot up at any moment. But the Middle East, um, schools are often devastated by bombing campaigns, either partially or wholly supported and or done by the U.S. government. Um, and ultimately,
And
uh, yeah,
hospitals as well.
yeah. So ultimately, I'm wondering because you say your wife taught at a public school. Is that or sorry,
A
private school?
private
Is that?
school, yeah, private English school, yeah, for adults.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah,
So so basically, that was sort of like uh a school for like continued learning past high school then.
right, exactly. They were all post high school kids or post high school students. Sorry, and people want to learn English in other countries. It's kind of what they feel like is their path to maybe higher earnings or advancing their career,
Right.
etc. So they end up enrolling in these English programs. And my wife taught at two different schools, but yeah,
Yeah, due to US empire and hegemony. Um
pretty much, yeah.
so um let me ask then cuz I mean she could probably still speak to this. How what's the sentiment growing up in Yemen? Like are kids constantly afraid or have they come to peace with it too? Is it just one of those things?
I mean, now I would say the primary concern is food insecurity more than the bombs, because if the bomb blows you up, you're done. But starving to death is a pretty bad way to go. And for a lot of kids in Yemen right now, it's already a country that imported most of its food. They don't produce a lot of their food,
Right.
and the U.S. Navy is blockading the country. So only approved things can get through. And as you can imagine, that kind of puts a little bit of a damper on how much actually gets into the country and who it gets to, most importantly, because you don't want to be feeding your enemies, quote unquote. So food insecurity is probably the more pressing concern for people, is whether or not you're going to be able to eat today.
Well, and of course, the bombing destroys infrastructure, and it also destroys the ability for like agriculture to even happen to begin with, because you've got to have commerce and like city infrastructure in order to run agricultural departments. So,
Yeah.
on that score, is was food insecurity impacted by these bombings as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Markets were destroyed. People who had maybe trees, fruit trees in their yards, some of those got destroyed in this. So yeah, absolutely.
And how many civilian casualties happened during? Because you said that there were two bombings, or were there more?
Um, and in that situation, I mean, there's been several bombings. It's goes on every day.
Oh,
Back
okay.
then, it was a regular. It just happened. Sana'a is a fairly larger city, so a bomb going off, far away may not impact you. You may only hear the rumbles of it. It's not, when it's actually happening, where you can see where the impact is, you can see the bomb fall and then blow up. That's a totally different thing. I mean, imagine if you're just looking out your backyard to your neighbor's house or something, and that's where the bomb blew up. I mean, you'd be a little bit afraid because, for all you know, they could miss drop the bomb and hit
Right.
your house.
Well, and also the fact is that like they might have the wrong target. They might be doing the wrong thing. Like these are Saudi bombs, right? Like U.S. bombs dropped by Saudi, right?
Yes,
Yeah. So ultimately, um, so
with the
you're
U.S. helping them target, with the U.S. giving them target and targeting information,
right.
targeting technology. So yeah,
So you're saying that there were bombs dropped literally every day. That there was basically no escape.
on after the war started, after it was March 26th, I believe it was. After that date, every time that I was talking with her on the phone, I could audibly hear in the background the bombs going off.
See, that's the thing that really gets me because if that was happening in the US, if like you could guarantee that like every day there would be like a bomb going off in like not practice cuz I grew up near military bases. I know how that sounds, but like uh going off with intent. The US would like have all out attacks. The US
Mhm.
would strike fast and strike hard. They would destroy whoever was doing that. But the US gets to help people do that sort of thing with impunity in other countries. Would you say that that's more to do with poverty, like the country's wealth level, or would it have more to do with the fact that the country has so many resources that they can pay for it?
Which country are we referring to?
Yemen.
I mean, they're being attacked because there's strategic value in controlling the country. So the goal is to have a friendly government in place. The Houthis are perceived as not being friendly to U.S. interests and Gulf country interests, and those countries are U.S. allies. The United States has bases all in those countries, in the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, of course. So being able to control Yemen and the ports in southern Yemen is very important to the U.S. empire. And that is the primary reason why they did not want to accept having their person, Mansour Hadi, being their kind of the puppet. They didn't want him to be thrown out of power.
Okay, so it's the US like puppet dictatorship kind of thing, like that hegemony I discussed earlier.
Yeah, yeah. You want to have somebody you can control. And for many years, that person was the former president, Saleh, who voluntarily stepped down as a result of the Arab Spring, that whole thing, that fiasco, and somebody else took over and kind of go from there.
That's interesting. So was your wife there for Arab Spring or
Yes.
all right, so what was her take on that?
I mean, she does not. She's very like me in that she's not a very political person, and didn't see what was going on as valuable. That it was kind of just rearranging
Deck
the
chairs on the
deck.
Titanic?
Exactly, yeah. Her father has kind of eschewed politics as well, and part of that is because he had several friends of his who tried to get involved in politics, but ended up having unfortunate accidents in their efforts. If you catch what I'm laying
Yeah.
down. So he kind of realized that it was not a way of a viable way forward in your own life. And so I think that kind of rubbed off on my wife as well. So, um, yeah.
Yeah, cuz like a lot of people think that that stuff is just by and gone, that it's all a thing of the past. That like now everything is just like corruption free and we're all democracies and everything is golden. but you're saying that it's basically just as brutal and kingmakery as it's always been, but with technology?
Yeah, well, with technology, but also, people want to point out, the double standard. Like they'll critique Assad in Syria and say, oh, he killed his own citizens, but then turned a blind eye whenever one of our allies do the same thing, maybe on a smaller scale, or maybe what have you. But they'll engage in political based violence and say, well, I'm killing my own enemies. But if they slap a U.S. ally sticker on it and don't have to worry about the repercussions.
Okay, so it's a veneer, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
All right, because I mean, it's interesting to me that politics, even over there, is pushing a significant amount of people away from politics, to the point where, um, like in general, the sentiment is that there's nothing you can do about it. That whatever the corruption, whatever the evil is, there's nothing you can do about it. That's very common here in the U.S., and it's why the vast majority of people don't vote, and why the Democrat and Republican tickets have to fight for scraps of like the remainder of people who don't vote. But nobody for president would typically win or have like a significant amount of power and traction if it was an option on the ballot. And it seems to me that that's not only true here, but from my limited research, also true everywhere else.
To some extent, and to another extent, I think what it does is it pushes people towards more extremes and more radicalism, because that's your only self-defense. If it's like rival gangs in prison. You know that you won't be able to make it on your own, so you kind of have to join up. And
Right.
so that's why you see people become armed rebels or extremists or whatever you want to call them. So that's another byproduct as well, as people reflexively become more violent, or radical in return, to response of state violence.
Yeah, like that line from personally, I think this is one of the most impactful songs out there. There's an artist called Faithless, and he wrote a song called Bombs. And there's a verse that goes, I'm gonna bury my wife and dig up my gun. My life is done, so now I have to kill someone. It's that mentality of like the only way out is with bullets or some sort of violence, and then this violence breeds enough violence that the cycle is allowed to continue because, oh, we've got to quell the violence, and it
Yeah.
never ends as long as there's a profit motive. So with regards to that, the bomb industry is huge. The Biden election saw spikes in every single military industrial stock.
Yep.
It's like people knew that as soon as you allow Biden back in, there's going to be a lot more war. Is that the same sentiment over in the Middle East right now? Do you still have any contacts there?
I mean, I know people who live there. My father-in-law still lives there, in Yemen. So, they feel that way, but I don't think that they necessarily felt that anything changed while Trump was in office.
Right.
So it's kind of just a constant. And with Biden in particular, I understand why he didn't, while he was vice president, why he didn't, throw Obama under the bus. But it's politics. He wanted to remain an insider, and he wouldn't be where he is right now if he had done so. But that's not a profile in courage.
Right.
You can't be this beacon of hope when you were playing politics as usual.
Well, and that's a running theme. I mean, I do want to touch on it though. Like, Trump is no saint. Like, while Obama did the first two assassinations in that family, and resulted in the deaths of Anwar and Abdul Rahman al Awlaki,
Yep.
the uh, the daughter, I think also named Anwar after her father,
Noir.
Nawar,
Noir.
yes,
Yep.
was eventually shot in the neck during a raid ordered by Trump.
Yep.
So,
Less
and
than a month into his presidency.
yeah, and then later on, he eliminates the mandate for drone reports. So, like,
Yep.
it's not like Trump is some sort of anti-military industrialist saint, and I don't want people to get the impression that I'm suddenly pro-Trump because Biden might get in. But um, something to keep in mind is that when Obama was in office, drone use skyrocketed, and
Yep.
not only is Biden in favor of massive crime legislation, anti-gun legislation, and the military-industrial complex, in addition to the prison-industrial complex, where, like, effectively he's saying, "Oh, we don't need prisons for drug users. We need mandatory rehabilitation,
Yeah.
which is,
Exactly.
prison with pillows."
Prison by another name. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, uh, things are gonna still be more of the same with him in office again. But, like, at the same time, we both know that he is huge into the military industrial complex, and that if anything, the veneer is going to be even lower, like, at this point, because Obama still had to have some sort of veneer of civil rights. Biden didn't even need to do that. This time around, all Biden needed to do was say "come on" a lot and talk about empty dinner tables. But the like his mandatory vaccination fetish and his mandatory, like, his basically COVID industrial complex that he wants to push through is going to involve a lot of Internet of Things kind of things. It's going to involve a lot of drone technology, and I think he's going to be Drone King 2.0. Even if and like, I think that there's a strong possibility he won't even reinstate the mandate for reporting, because why would he? So
Right.
it's it's going to be interesting to see how many people were against Trump for various things like that, how loud the anti-war left got during Trump, and how quiet they might be again when Biden is back.
I didn't see very many of them very loud during Trump anyway. I mean, of all the things that people mentioned when it came to impeaching Trump, not one of them mentioned anything having to do with war or the empire. I mean, if it was up to me, page one of that impeachment would have been the murder of Nawar al-Awlaki.
Yeah,
I mean, there was no congressional approval of that. Not that that matters to me personally as somebody, politically, but there was no, if you want to follow the Constitution, there was no constitutional authority to do that. The Congress didn't tell them to do that. And, ordering troops into a sovereign country and having an American citizen, by the way, Noir Al-Awlaki, she was murdered. I mean, it's
right.
point blank. That's what happened. And nothing, just crickets. And if you're not willing to, put that out there, what are you doing?
Well, and like, that's part of it, because the CIA is the one who takes care of a lot of assassinations anyway, and
Hmm.
the fact is we just don't hear about them.
Yeah.
Um, so, like, American citizens are regularly killed anyway by a part of the government that we literally just don't hear about, and it's like an unfortunate accident, or it's off the records, or it's like, an automobile collision when they cut the brakes, or it's something like that where we don't even know. The only reason we know about Anwar and Abdul Rahman is because they wanted to use it as a cudgel to say, if you step out of line, this is what you're gonna get. So, um,
Well, and a lot of times, what these other regimes that we are, quote unquote, allies with, um, they give us names to assassinate that aren't, extremists, aren't bad people, quote unquote. They are political enemies, and
right.
so we're being used as the assassination hit squad for brutal regimes.
In exchange for resource control, regional footholds, corporate allies,
Yep.
and, of course, the almighty dollar, because, like, the fact is, the only reason the US dollar hasn't gone belly up yet, even though it could have, is because the US has constantly incurred debt in order to pay for all these programs, and that debt can be used, like, by people with leverage, like China, to, for instance, guard opium fields in Afghanistan. So,
Yep.
like, ultimately, the purpose of the US over there is to support and safeguard US interests, and they don't really care about freedom, justice, democracy, any of that. They just care about having people in there who play ball well enough that they can continue to be brutal and murderous for profit.
Yep. And that's why personally, I at least, as much as I disagree with pragmatists who say, if the United States didn't do this, China would do it, or Russia, or whatever, nonsense they come up with, at least their argument is not from some kind of altruistic or idealistic point of view where they think we're spreading democracy or we're doing some kind of good thing overseas. At least people who are more pragmatic on this, they at least acknowledge that it's not perfect, but I still feel that they're wrong on that. And so what really annoys me are the people who kind of feel like now that Biden and Kamala Harris are now in office, we're going to have some era of rainbow and sunshine, when in reality it's ugly.
Yeah, well, and Kamala got like part of her support from military and prison industrialist venture capital firms and people who were adjacent to that. Same with Biden, only his stuff was filtered through PACs. So the idea that they're going to be suddenly the liberal president utopians, pretty much ignorant of history, because ultimately, and this is something that right wingers don't like to hear, Biden isn't very far left. He's not like a communist. He's not like some
If
sort
anything,
of,
he's more fascist.
yeah. I mean, he competes. I mean, because Trump was pretty fascist. He
Hmm.
and
Yep.
still it still is with some of the stuff he does. That's why he only praised WikiLeaks when they were going after his opponents, and when it came to pardoning Assange, who helped his campaign, he let him rot in a box and get psychologically damaged and malnourished and shit, because it's much easier to just wait for a problem to go away on its own than it is to deal with the fact that you're betraying the kinds of people who helped you get in. Um, so it's pretty amusing to me when people think that Biden is any better, because it's not like he didn't put a huge amount of people in prison, and it's not like his VP didn't fucking like throw true parents of truant children into incarceration. It's not like they both didn't support crime bills and that they both didn't support massively racist policies. Suddenly, because we've got somebody in the vice presidential position who's not only a woman but a biracial woman, with like, I think she's half Indian, half black. Um, she gets to suddenly come in and be the superhero, even though she's got a terrible track record, and she gets to go along with Biden, who's also got a terrible track record, and still had the audacity to say that if you didn't vote for him, you ain't black. Um, so it's amusing, and it's amusing to me that people still cut him enough slack that he can get away with this stuff in the public eye. But if your only if your only like issue that you care about is that he's not Trump, he's not Orange Man, and an Orange Man is bad, then I guess he fills all your quotas. He checks all your boxes. But if you actually want somebody who's liberal, or if you want somebody who's going to be even libertarian about some of these issues, you need to run the fuck away from Biden, because his primary policies are going to result in a huge amount of oppression. And not just oppression, but now that he's got the reins, what he let happen in the Middle East as vice president, he'll probably make happen in the Middle East now that he has the presidential power to declare non-war conflicts, which is always fun because
Yeah.
Congress needs to approve of things if they're actual wars.
Right. Well, and when Obama took office, I'm old enough to remember that. He said he was going to get us out of Iraq and we'd get out of Afghanistan and all this stuff, and look how that worked out. So, this story about Biden, and on his website he talks about getting us out of the Yemen conflict and all this stuff. I'll believe it when I see it. And I am fairly confident that nothing is going to happen, and it's just going to have the same situation. And people on the left, or Democrats, however they consider themselves, they're not going to say anything. And when you bring it up as critique, they're going to dismiss it or say that, because I've had people tell me, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, that anytime I mention what is going on in Yemen and how it's wrong, it's Russian propaganda.
Right.
Because it's of course, we have to bomb poor people overseas to stick it to the Russians.
Right. And that's the thing. Even if he does fucking actually do something in that regard and pull people out, it's not like he's not going to put them anywhere else. It's not like
Yeah.
he's not going to find an excuse to go into Ethiopia for some emeralds or some shit. You know,
Yep.
like there's always going to be an excuse for more expansionism. And with people like Biden in office, those excuses will always make the blood flow. So ultimately, I have zero confidence in a Biden presidency to do anything in that regard, and I have 100% confidence that he's going to continue business as usual, and that he's going to restrict freedom enough that the right will have a right lash again, and Trump's campaign slogan in 2024 will be something like "Miss me yet."
Yeah,
So
probably.
I don't foresee this getting any better. Certainly not because of Biden. And I wanted to have you on because I think that there's a human cost to these sorts of conflicts that most people don't consider because they're disconnected from it and because they don't even think about the news. When I auto post my antiwar.com articles, not mine, but somebody else's antiwar.com articles, some of them
Hmm.
are about the regular death toll in Iraq and other places in the Middle East. And when people see that, hey, the kinds of things that we would consider mass death, which would be trending on Twitter if it happened in the West, suddenly, like, the only people talking about it are a few fringe hippies. I wonder why that is.
That is because people don't care, or they don't have any connection to it. I happen to have been against this kind of stuff before it was a personal issue, just from a personal principles type of
Right.
standpoint. But this has just added to it, and certainly added to my annoyance and frustration and just anger about what has gone on and why. And the fact, honestly, that being powerless to stop it is another issue in and of itself.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that about wraps it up. Where can people find you, and what would you like to tell Biden if you could?
I would like to tell him that I think he's should reconsider his whole career. Everything he's ever done, I think he needs to just second guess all of it and undo. Anything that he does in whether it's 4 or 8 years or however long he's in office, if he can reverse every single thing he's ever done, that would be a great one first step. Honestly, people can find me on Twitter, just at Andrew Blackmer. Um, and feel free to follow me. And occasionally I write blog posts if the mood fits me, and you can check out what I'm writing. It's on my page. So
All right. Well, thank you for coming on because I'm going to start this series. If any of you have any negative experiences resulting from policies or things that Biden has approved of, let me know and we'll get you on to discuss this because I want to remove this veneer and I want to expose him for the corrupt piece of shit he is. So, with that being said, this has been Jeremiah Talks. Smash the